battles are not about who has the biggest army.
That's what she said.
It's more about a wacky rock paper scissors on steroids mechanic featuring 4 different types of damage that do not work how you might expect them to. Today we're diving headfirst into a recently rediscovered gem, Fantasy General. We're talking epic battles with wyverns, cavalry and volunteer peasant militias, all wrapped up in a charmingly retro package. We'll explore the various game modes, mechanics, as well as the game's release context and its influence through time. Fantasy General was the 3rd title in what would become known as the 5-Star General series of video games, preceded by the original Panzer General and Allied General, and then followed by many more, including People's General and Star General. What sets Fantasy General aside immediately is obviously the fantasy setting, the very high fantasy setting. Instead of tanks and guns, you command wyverns and dwarven axemen. Instead of guns and bombs, you field slingers and spellcasters. Although firearms do exist and show up, more on that later. It might look like a reskin of the original Panzer General at first glance, but trust me, it feels completely different. One key difference is the unit size. In Fantasy General, you lead smaller squads, typically around 15 soldiers each, while in Panzer General, you lead battalion-sized units. This might seem minor, but it makes visualizing the battles way easier. Plus, the fantasy setting adds a whole new layer of strategy with magic spells and powerful hero units who can turn the tide of battle when used correctly. You get to choose from 4 different commanders, each with their own playstyle. Want to unleash devastating spells? Go for Archmage Krell. Prefer a more hands-on approach? Then Knight Marshal Callis, the melee specialist, is your guy. This kind of variety wasn't as present in turn-based tactical wargames back then, and it makes the game seem much more current now because of it. Oh, and you can even rename your hero for that extra bit of personalization. That bit of modernity aside, do not expect dynamically shifting environments, simultaneous unit movement, or hand-holding tutorials. It's still a solid strategy game, but Fantasy General is a considerably no-frills old-school approach, much more akin to a tabletop wargaming experience where you plan your moves and then watch them unfold. But hey, that is part of the charm. Combat in Fantasy General, oddly enough, is possibly the least intuitive thing about it, even when you account for the high fantasy setting. Battles are not about who has the biggest army.
That's what she said.
Although that can help, it's more about a wacky rock paper scissors on steroids mechanic featuring 4 different types of damage that do not work how you might expect them to. How can you get a sense of what's going on without the old trial and error method? Well, you gotta read the manual. Or, I'll make a video about it going into detail. Let me know if that's something you might want to see. The gist is that some types of attacks will go uncountered when used against enemy units that have different types of attacks, thus ensuring maximum damage is applied while none is sustained during said attack. It's not necessarily that simple, but that's the gist of it. And then there's the gold. You need it to buy new troops, but also to research upgraded ones. There's an entire research screen where you can invest percentages of your money into researching new troops, allowing you to modify how much each type of unit gets. It's a really cool extra strategic layer to place on top of everything else, seeing as how you may have particular units you like to use, but during a campaign you might find some other units more useful in particular situations. And to take it home completely, the game also features some light RPG elements. You can rename all of your units and thus make your own fantasy dream team party of characters, so that's always fun, but they also gain experience as they go from battle to battle, and you can also outfit them with magical items. There are 4 types of units: mortal, magical, beast, and mechanical units, each having their own pros and cons, and each hero will have access to unique units relevant to their theme. For instance, the Archmage and the Sorceress will have access to magical and beast units unavailable to the Knight, and this is another aspect of how the game allows you to approach it with different playstyles. Fantasy General also comes back with a surprisingly diverse array of different game modes. The main story campaign follows the story of the world of Air.
Air was a world
Of Air, which is invaded by a Shadow Lord who appears in the aftermath of a new dark continent forming from within the depths of the sea. This Shadow Lord is an incarnation of evil who can raise the dead and do all manner of adjacent evil stuff to a world woefully unprepared for such a conflict. Your chosen hero is part of the first organized resistance to this invader and has to liberate the various continents of Air through various battles and army management. There are also 5 standalone scenarios where research isn't necessary and you have access to already upgraded versions of units. The arena refers to basically a skirmish game against a computer or human enemy, which you can play by email when it comes to the human enemy, which sounds super quaint for today's standards of everything multiplayer and online and such, but it's just a fun feature to have in this sort of game for the more time-pressed adult. What sets the general games aside from similar turn-based warfare games is that each mission has to be completed within an allotted number of turns. Doesn't matter how close you are to the goal, you could be 1 hex away from occupying the last city you need to. If that's where your last turn ends, you lost. That said, whenever you lose, you almost never feel robbed, because it's usually down to a series of bad decisions you made throughout the campaign, or even the mission. The game pushes you to give it another try, and you're willing to do it because choosing a different hero will further offer a wholly different experience. So the replayability is off the charts, despite the game only offering a fairly limited number of set scenarios. The visuals are possibly the most underrated aspect of fantasy general. The pixel art is positively oozing with high fantasy atmosphere. The unit sprites are still more than passable in terms of modern tastes, featuring some pretty diverse death animations as well. The hero portraits are just stupendous and make me sad that more of this artwork doesn't exist. The only other place where it can be seen is in the unit descriptions, where the units are illustrated as sketches, which are likewise dope as hell. At the very start of the video, I said the game is a recently rediscovered classic as opposed to the more cliched forgotten classic, and that's because 2019 saw the release of a direct sequel after 23 years. Fantasy General 2 comes with all the trappings of modern games such as flashy graphics and a 3D engine, but this doesn't mean the original's influence had not been present in the intervening 2 decades. You can clearly see glimpses of Fantasy General in games such as Age of Wonders, Eador, or Fantasy Wars, which even borrows the first word for its title as a means of connecting itself to the classic. But is Fantasy General the best of the 5-star generals? That's a more nuanced discussion than you think. Overall, Fantasy General is a fantastic strategy game that holds up surprisingly well even after 30 years. The turn-based mechanics might feel a tad slow by modern standards, but the fantasy setting, tactical depth, and hero system still offer a compelling and engaging experience. The first 2 Panzer General titles have been more popular, in part because of their real-world historical aspect, but it seems those base mechanics are much better when adapted into the fantasy setting. When you add the immense amount of replayability I mentioned earlier, with the exception of one subjective preference towards a real-world setting, Fantasy General might just be the best of the 5-star generals. Do you agree with that assessment? Let me know in the comments, I'm curious to know.